Right. Hey, everybody, and welcome. Good afternoon. If you're watching us live, or good evening. I know it's summertime, so I appreciate you all joining while you try to get the last maybe summer vacation or holiday in. I'm really excited to have you all here. We've got an awesome show today. This is the 13th episode of our When Things Go Wrong webinar series. And I am, as always, super excited to have our panelists on the show. Today, I've known these two gentlemen since 2018, I guess Ralph since actually 2017. You know, I'll never forget when I first met Ralph in Toronto. I literally had no idea what I was getting myself into, this whole standards world, but I soon realized that I'd stumbled upon something incredibly powerful, and I'm really grateful for his mentorship and leadership amongst many others that have brought me to some of the takeaways and lessons learned that I've come to today, and that I'm excited to share with you all. Just some housekeeping before we dive in. This webinar is recorded, so if you've got a colleague or friend that you can't that couldn't make it, or you've got to jump early for some reason, you can check that out later. You can subscribe on our YouTube channel and get access to all of not only this episode but all previous episodes, which we'll throw in the chat for you. This is for you guys. I do this as a service to the attendees. So what I mean by that is, what I want you to do is ask questions. We got some great questions during the registration form. Thank you all. But use the Q&A during if something comes to mind, and throw your questions out there. You also have the option to ask anonymously as well. If we are not able to get to your question, because we do have 1 hour here, I'll do my best to get you an answer after. We will give a summary of everything that we discussed, and that will include answers to the questions. So thank you for attending, and let's see, where shall we begin? Today's topic is about standards, and that word is, I'd say, overused. We use it without even thinking, and it sounds dry. We take it for granted, but I promise you, it's fun. And I'm going to do my best to make sure it is fun. And I think Ralph and Cary are also going to help me with that and not let me down. As individuals going about our everyday lives, we really take for granted that standards are deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. It's only when standards don't exist, or perhaps they're not being adhered to, that we realize there's a problem. And everything from your USB cable to your power outlets, crayons, like there isn't anything, the roads we drive on, the bridges, airplane parts, everything is based on a standard pretty much. So this is an engaging topic where I think to understand a bit more about how the sausage is made and how you can actually participate in that process to shape the outcome is one thing that I hope you'll take away from today. So with that, I could not be more honored to have my two individuals, Cary and Ralph, with, I think, collectively bring more experience of standards and global trade than I've been on this planet. So with that, I'd like to, Ralph, bring you up first, sir, and introduce yourself. Again, thanks for coming. Give me a bit about you and your background and how the heck you got here.
Thank you. Good evening, David, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I've been involved. I'm a chemist by background. I actually worked for construction research for many years, and into metrology later on, meaning measurement science. But standards-wise, I've been living in the world of standards since the early 90s as far as developing them. But throughout my career, I've been using standards to be able to, do analysis, etc. But involved with the standards writing itself for the last 30 years or so, or 35 years, I'd say. And it's been lots of fun, and it's been interesting over time. The cannabis world has been opened, of course, in Canada since 2018 is when it got legalized. So that's why back in 2017, the committee got formed, and trying to help out with making sure that we have standards, because it was surprising to see how few standards, as in there were no standards really. There were, from the point of view of a mixture of industry, users, as well as government people involved.
Awesome. Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, so excited to have you. You were literally at the table when the decisions at the board of ASTM and years leading up to that came to be around, should we even form and have a committee, if I recall.
Correct.
Thanks. Cary, sir, it's such a pleasure to see you as always. I'll get down. We'll have some crawfish boils again sometime soon, but
Indeed.
welcome. You also do not come from the cannabis industry, but I know you've been doing quite a bit of work. What the heck brought you here? How'd you end up here? Cary, give us a bit about yourself.
Yeah. Well, this thing called life sometimes creates unusual paths that fall before you, and sometimes you're somewhat foolhardy like I am, and I just start walking down them because they might be more interesting than the one I'm standing on, which is basically what kind of happened. It started out with Dr. Paroli. Ralph and I have known each other since 2004. And I joined DO8 as representative of Duralast roofing and PVC single ply roofing applications. And Ralph was my mentor at ASTM, and ended up working with him, ended up writing a standard there. And actually ended up going out to NRC doing research in Ralph's lab for Duralast for some really interesting sort of new roofing applications, particularly with TPOs and that kind of stuff. Anyway, became a good friend of Ralph's. Life went on, moved to New Orleans, became the quality manager for a sugar refining laboratory. And I met Ralph at Bacchanal's in New Orleans, and we were drinking some fine red wine. And he said, you should come down to the ASTM meeting because D37 on cannabis is meeting, and I'm the chairman of that. And at first he said, guess what committee I'm now chairman of? And I, of course, knowing Ralph as well as I do, I probably wouldn't have come up with cannabis on the first guess. But no, it was, he wanted me to come down and wanted me to mentor some of the new people down there, just because I'd been an officer and been through that process. So I did, and I ended up walking out of there as the vice chair for D3702, working with Andrew Saman, and got to know Andrew really well. And he said, well, why don't you come do consulting with me? So I happily resigned from Dow Chemical and took a plunge off a path that I really had no certainty with, but it's defined a really cool lifestyle for me for the last 5 years now or whatever. Anyway, that's how I ended up there. And it was through Ralph and his requesting me to go there and check it out. And I started participating since I joined D37. I've written nine of the standards that we have in D37, which I'm rather proud about, but that's good. And I got a few more in the queue I'm working on.
No shortage. Well, I think, Cary, you hit on an important theme that I know will be part of our takeaway, is like just showing up is 90+% of the battle. And if you show up, the ability to have an opportunity to lead and create the playbook is literally that easy. Like, I mean, there's a lot of work to it. Don't get us wrong, right? But you showed up, and that without being there in person, those opportunities would not have been afforded to you to make an impact that I know you have. Building on that, I want to actually go back to when you were at Duralast and developing a standard. So, here we are in the cannabis industry, where I think we're all still figuring out how to still use this process 6 years in and what the value of it is. So why on earth did your company say, go to ASTM, spend your time, I'm assuming your company supported this, to create a standard, and like, what was the value of that? What problem were you solving?
Well, in this case, we're talking about the roofing industry, and it's guided by construction codes. And there's a certain requirement for single ply roofing in the United States that you cannot put a single ply roofing membrane down unless it has the stamp conforms to ASTM 4434, which is the product specification standard. So we had a vested interest in that standard and the content of it, as did all our competitors. And so, yeah, we were absolutely present and accounted for. And obviously, we're all lobbying for the advantages our system might have over Sikas or Firestones or whatever, right? And so we yelled at each other a lot, and of course we're all competitors, but then we'd all go out to dinner and have a great old time. It was a really interesting and cool dynamic, and we needed presence there. We needed to affect the industry. We needed to play a role in the standards that dictated our success and our ability to market, essentially.
So, I think building on that context, right, to draw on what other industries have seen the value in utilizing standards, part of that comes back in your case to, code and enforcement, and, these codes incorporate standards so that if you want to be marketplace relevant, you've got to show that your product can conform, right? Hey, Ralph, you sit from, Canada's perspective, you've worked in government your life, but you've been, I think, part of these arguments and shouting matches, and probably also gone out to dinner and had a good time afterwards. So like, what's the value to people from your perspective? Why are you such a supporter of standards and ASTM?
The idea behind standards, which I'm a big supporter, is that we want safer products, and you want products which actually reflect also what's available out there. So you have to find the right balance where there's innovation going on, and yet at the same time, you want to be able to help advance this innovation in a safe way, and you want the consumers to know that they're getting a product they can rely upon. Recently we went through the pandemic. All the masks we were wearing, for example, those are these are ASTM standards for those masks, and or NIOSH if you're wearing the respirators. Those are all important things, and you want to. That's the only, and I got involved by being at the table because I was on cost recovery for clients, and the clients said, you've got some great ideas. We were trying to figure out how to make things last longer. There were problems with roofs and etc. And by being at the table, I was able to get my ideas through as to how to make it to improve the standards. People can't be there and do it for you if it's your idea. They can try, but they'll never do as good a job as you yourself when questions come up. And so that's why it's critical. But from a government agency perspective, it's because it's critical to be at the table to make sure that you're representing the public and that they're getting safer products, knowing that, because consumers need to know what's available, what's in the product. For example, in cannabis, you want to make sure there's no pesticide. You want to make sure that how much THC they're getting. It's very important from a government regulatory side. And if you're not at the table, you can't influence that because you can't send that message across. So you really have to be present to do that.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Go ahead, Cary.
I was just gonna add also, just the way ASTM's set up, there is that need of being present and accounted for and sharing your ideas. But you might not have you might have a good chunk of ideas, and you may be missing out here a little bit and missing out there. But because of the way ASTM goes to business, you might have 300 other subject matter experts that might see that lens through a little different angle. And so now you start getting discussion, and it's a synergistic thing where, best practices kind of converge on what is the ultimate best practice, that kind of thing. The power of many over the power of one is manifest in the whole ASTM process, which I think is really cool. And I just wanted to throw that in as sort of an additive comment to what Ralph was saying.
No, thanks. I think I want to build on that a bit, because I know, some of the concerns I've heard, including from, regulators and government is, like Cary, you mentioned industry and lobbying, right? And that, that scares folks, right? Where it's like, there's a commercial interest, and then, influencing process can have this negative connotation because of the need to, be careful with what we say, how that, how the outcome is influenced. But I think ASTM, and Ralph, definitely want to hear your perspectives on this from your lens, like, is the place where that is actually encouraged and is valued because of the process. That's what it's there for, right? Is to make sure that everybody's voice is heard at the table and dare I say, a safe space. Can you address any of those concerns and, how the ASTM kind of process plays out from a bias standpoint and makes it equitable for all to speak? And then
is it for me or for Cary? Sorry.
Well, I can give my thoughts on that.
Sure.
Go ahead, Cary.
ASTM is a very welcoming organization, and people that want to come in and contribute are given the floor to speak. And I've certainly I've been in some meetings where we're yelling at each other and not agreeing, and I'd always throw the trump card, well, show your data. And that oftentimes shut people up real quick because they didn't have the data or whatever. But all that being said, it was all very professional, and everyone would give each other hugs and enjoy dinner afterwards, even though we were competitors. And so really just you got to get in and you got to say your piece. And the overall environment of ASTM is nurturing to that point. It always has been ever since I've been involved with it. And I've never had any fear to speak against the group if I didn't think it was quite right. And oftentimes other people would say, oh yeah, well, I was thinking that too. I was just the only one that said it, but I'm kind of famous for that. That's probably a problem. Anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
and
thanks for
from
your
that
question. Ralph,
perspective,
go ahead.
and that's the key part about, there are many standard developing bodies out there, or organizations, SDOs as we call them. What I liked about ASTM is, even though I was from Canada, for example, I had a harder time getting at the table with Canadian standards than at ASTM. At ASTM, all you have to do is be a member. And if you're a member, you have a voice. The way it works is every single person has a chance to voice their opinion. You only have one vote per company, so to speak. However, you still have to be, your negative or your vote, your views have to be addressed. And everybody listens. And what's nice about ASTM is that it's a very well-balanced approach. So you can't have, industry can only be like 1/3 of the committee from a voting perspective. Many more can be there, but as far as influencing the way it works and how the standards are written, it'll be only about 1/3 of them that will be there and the vote. The rest are government regulators, users, general public, consumer groups, etc. So you really do get a very nicely balanced approach. And as Cary mentioned, we do get at each other, but it's a bit like, for those of you who are old enough or have seen the reruns of the Coyote with the shepherd dogs, they go around, they spend their day, they start off the day by saying hi, then they clock in, they go at each other's throat, then they clock out, and then they say, okay, have a good dinner, say hi to your spouse for me, etc., etc. And that's the way we work. We really are not doing anything. We're not attacking each other personally. And the other part that's important to remember is to be able to, because Cary mentioned about a safe space, it's because we do not, unlike this here where we're recording this presentation, of course, at ASTM, meetings are not recorded. So that was because this way people can speak their minds, say what they have to say, and not be worried that this could be thrown back at them later on. It's going to be at the meeting itself. Sometimes we say things in the heat of the moment. That's okay. We all apologize to each other, and then we move on and continue working together.
I think that's a really important perspective, and yeah, thanks for sharing that. Even from the the balance of voting, I know something that once I recognized that, it kind of answered a lot of questions around, what if a bunch of people show up and dominate with one idea? How does that, it shouldn't be that the loudest voice in the room is what carries, right? There can be perceptions of that and it can feel that way, but when it comes down to it, the blocking and for the balance of votes with one vote per company and then a balance of interest weighs it so that when you have to have consensus, which does not mean unanimity, right? But it does mean a majority, that the public health interests are first and foremost without stifling innovation, right? Because I think Cary's example, show me the data, that data tells the story and can confirm and convince folks or refute something.
Yes. And also, even for those who cannot show up to the meeting, I don't want people to feel that, okay, they couldn't show up, so therefore they're left out of the process. No, everything is done by emails, electronic balloting. So you get to participate that way. And even if you can't come to a meeting, you can participate in our WebEx meetings as well. So there's a lot of ways that people can participate, even if they can't show up. Again, it's preferable if they do show up, of course, but if they can't, there are other ways to participate.
Yep. No, thanks, Ralph. I want to take a moment to just reflect on, the term bias and how, that is a really important concept that, we all live with bias, right? We all have bias. And regardless, like whether they're, known biases or unknowns, that are innate or learned, we all have them. And that's the beauty of ASTM and other standards development organization processes. This ties back to the World Trade Organization's principles, right? And ensuring that there's openness, transparency, and removal of bias to the extent that is practical. There's no perfect system in the world. I'd even say this could be perceived as a biased webinar because we are definitely talking about ASTM. It's where I know you guys, right? It's where I'm the most familiar. But Ralph, I know you've worked with a lot of other SDOs, and every organization and entity has its strengths and weaknesses, but there are those overarching World Trade Organization 6 principles for technical barriers to trade that really underpins everything that we do in our operation as volunteers at ASTM and with any other accredited standards development organization that's out there, which I'll give some shout outs later, but I just wanted to put that out there. Anything you want to add on that, Ralph? Because I know you've done a lot of work with MOUs internationally and expanding the reach for emerging marketplaces globally to be able to use these standards and remove those barriers to trade. Go ahead.
Yeah, so ASTM actually has its standards are used around the world, which represents roughly 95% of the world population. So to give you an idea of how the extent it is, the reason why today, of course, we are talking mainly about ASTM is from a cannabis perspective. As far as a major SDO is concerned, ASTM is the only one who took the step to work on this, and at a time when not everybody was open to it. So that's why we talk mainly about ASTM. But even then, again, unlike other SDOs, where people have to be invited to be at the table, everybody is there at ASTM. And so yes, you can have your biases, of course, and things like that. But when you vote, we don't look at where you're voting from, right? It really is a question of being able to put in your ballot, you send it in, and it's considered and it's looked at. And ASTM has MOUs with over 100 different countries around the world, which means that when we do the work at our committee, for example, it gets picked up elsewhere. So for example, Jamaica immediately almost took on 4 of our standards into their regulations. That was pretty good because I mean, if you look at how fast we've developed standards, thanks to people like yourself and Cary, we have, and of course a lot of other volunteers, we have about 40 or so standards on the books. Considering that we've only been around for a few years, literally 6-7 years, it's fantastic. And so there's a dearth of standards out there. We're producing them and they get picked up. And then whether it's in the South America or elsewhere, or they pick up those standards and are able to start using them right away.
Thanks, Ralph. And I think it's really, again, perspective around, we don't know what we don't know as an industry, and recognizing that 51 standards now at last count that I saw, maybe it's 52, but yeah, 51 in 6 years is incredible. And these are living, breathing documents. We're not going to get into the nuances. There's a lot of training and resources available if you want to know the details of how the ASTM process works, including the requirement for revisions of standards and the ability for, Cary to publish a standard tomorrow or push through the process and have a standard be approved. And then I show up the day after it gets an official, designation number, and I take that standard as a work item and revise it. Like, I don't have to wait 5 years. That's just, a small snippet of how that process is open to all. It's really important. Thinking about some of the challenges in the cannabis industry, one that really comes to mind, there's a few, but one that's top of mind, especially with Congress and here in the US, is recent requests for information on CBD and hemp cannabinoids. Is it marijuana? Is it hemp? Is it cannabis? Is it all the above? That's a can of worms, and I'm not here to say, Ralph and Cary, what are your perspectives? Because I think we all have some, but put that in context. Ralph, I want to kind of go to you first. What have you seen? Is there any good analogies of other industries that we could maybe relate to where basic terminology has been hotly debated and is really fractured or potentially fractured in industry, that ASTM's been the source of solutions?
Well, yeah, so whether or not ASTM is the source of solution in all of these cases, I wouldn't be able to say, but for example, it's not uncommon. I mean, look at grape juice, right? Grape juice could be made into wine, but we have grape juice, right? And we have wine. And so there's space for everything. And there are a lot of cases where it is all about terminology. I mean, you mentioned, for example, the marijuana versus hemp. Of course, we went away from the word marijuana for various reasons, but mainly because in the US, it was seen in a derogatory way. So we decided that it would not be used. So we used the word cannabis, which is what around the world they're all trying to use for the same reason now. We've convinced others to do that. And we have hemp. Hemp has been around for many years. So that's the problem that we run into. But again, it really comes down to what the regulators need and want. And because they're the ones, in a lot of the cases I've seen where there's been this debate, is it an oil or is it a legume or is it a fruit or whatever? It's because of taxation. So it comes down to what does the government want to see? If the government wants to see certain things, then they have to be at the table to reflect to us what they want, and we can start working on it. Otherwise, it's very difficult to come up with some sort of answer. But really, going back to the way the whole process works, it's going in there with an open mind and being willing to come in with something with just middle ground. That's really what's important. There's no right or wrong. It's what is best for the industry or for the stakeholders at large. And and again, if you keep thinking of the idea is to make sure that you want safer products for the public, if that's the ultimate goal for everybody, then we should be able to find out, find the middle ground on this.
No, and I think the term market relevant comes to mind with that too, right, Ralph? Like there's we can have a scientific discussion and bring it back to the grape juice and wine. Like, what's the difference? At what point does the threshold change that it's grape juice to wine? Scientists and engineers have nerded out and figured that and put lines in the sand for taxation reasons, etc. But is it rooted? There's scientific elements of it, but that's a wine and grape juice is a common term for consumers. There's market relevance, so we shouldn't get hung up, and that's again what the process stands for. Is there's a way to do this for all, so that it can be truly market relevant and protect consumers. And it's easy to get caught in the weeds, shall we say, with that. And kind of building on that, Cary, you're the chair of one of our subcommittees. There's no shortage of problems in the industry. You've worked across roofing. I know we've got a geology background in common as well. You've worked at a sugar factory, so you've seen quite a bit of different manufacturing landscapes and different uses of standards. When I think about food and sugar, there's SQF and GFSI schemes. What are the commonalities and differences that you've seen that maybe can apply to the cannabis industry in your experience? You kind of thread that for us.
Sure, to some extent. I come, in all the work that I've done for all the different entities, whether as a chemist or a geologist or a lab manager or quality manager, it's my regime has always been in the quality sciences, right? Like, I'm a certified quality engineer. I did all the Six Sigma stuff, and really that idea of a system that works well needing to be guided by a quality management system of some kind, and that is a common denominator across all those industries. Even in the sugar refinery, we use Toyota as an example of what a good quality management system looks like, and emulated that, which then helps us drive conforming to the specific guidelines. In our case, it was SQF, as to food safety and that kind of thing. But the quality management system set up the infrastructure for that to succeed. And the same thing goes with Duralast. The same thing goes obviously with Toyota. And the same thing goes with the cannabis industry and entities that I've consulted in terms of their product safety, normally echoing the guidelines of 21 CFR 111 or 21 CFR 117, right? You got to have that quality management set up to drive that train. And I'd say that would be the common denominator. And it doesn't have to be like the full-blown Dr. Deming approved system, but there has to be a system there that controls the documents and does corrective actions and recognizes the value of recording those results and being able to archive them and have your document control and your standard operating procedures. Especially, think about it, if you're in a sugar refinery that refines 8 million pounds of sugar every 24 hours and supplies sugar to the whole bottom part of the United States, it all needs to be made pretty much consistently. And there's SOPs to drive that train. The vacuum pans have very specific parameters, the dwell times, the recrystallization events, they're very specific. And if you deviate from that, then you have non-conformances, right? And then now at that point, it was a total waste. You just put it back to the front end and remelt it and then recrystallize it, right? But in some cases, non-conformances can be very expensive and result in scrap and downtime and that. But no, that quality management system, I think, is a very important part of that, however you choose to implement. And that's where we help clients in the industry, is to find the QMS that allows them to maximize their processes, to maximize and mitigate risks to their consumers or their customers.
I think that's actually a really good, common thread there, and tease up what I believe, if I interpret the question correctly, and the individual that asked it, if I incorrectly interpret what AIAG is, please let me know. But talking about quality, right, and processes being foundational to any operation is what I think I heard there, Cary, right? Like whether it's in roofing or the production of sugar, you've got to have specifications to determine go, no-go zones, and you've got to have quality oversight and ways to handle that. And failure to build quality into your process is really expensive, right? When it comes to non-conformances and rework and crystallization, those examples, folks that are in the isolate business, I think will relate to some parallel terminology there. But thinking about suppliers, one of the questions here was, along with ASTM, do you see AIAG, which I think is regarding the automotive industry action group, practices becoming more commonplace? And I don't know if either of you are more familiar with who AIAG is and how they work, but if I were to go on a limb short of that to say that's more of an industry-driven group that continues to keep the bar raised on their suppliers, pushes on suppliers and minimum standards. Is that something that you see being more commonplace to the industry? And if not, like, how does this work? Go ahead, Ralph, you've got a question.
So I think things like AIG are fantastic. And I think it's good to see that within the manufacturers themselves, they're trying to promote something. But the problem I find in general is it only represents one sector. So it's what they see as a problem, not necessarily what other people see as a problem as well. And again, by using a standard, so those could be fed into standards. Once they develop something there, they can bring it to the standards body and say, okay, what do we do and how do we, how can we get this to a standard, which is fine if we do it that way. But yet, I think you need to be able to make sure that you've got the general public there, the regulators, the users, all at the table, saying, no, that's not what we see as a problem. We see this as a problem. And there it helps advance these issues. And, when people then try to promote a certain view, like, for example, the manufacturers will say, well, no, we want this to be there. Well, so they can vote negative on what we say. That's fine. Or somebody else can say, no, we vote negative. We have to figure out how do we come to a consensus on that approach. And that's what's nice. Everybody has a viewpoint, and they bring in different answers and different solutions, but it really is collectively we come up with a better product.
I think that's, I appreciate that perspective, because I think about, that's some common rejections and discussions I've had with folks before, with like, well, industry, we've developed a standard, whether it's a trade group or otherwise. And if you think about how do you get buy-in, right? If industry says it's great, but if the regulators are sitting there saying, I'm skeptical and I haven't participated in this and I don't understand or I don't trust it, then how much weight is it going to carry, right? How much confidence and trust will it have? And perhaps in some industries that works. I don't see cannabis I see a major trust issue in our industry among all sides, right? Even, with government, right? I mean, 80 years of prohibition, it's hard to trust government to be able to do the right thing. So how do we ensure that the voices of industry operators, consumers, folks that want quality, safe products can have their voice heard and something we can all agree on. You can't do that with a one-sided group, right? And I think that's the important point there. Maybe in other facets it can exist, and certainly it can be used as a foundation. Folks should band together and work together in groups and build together, but we can't be in silos and say, well, Cary, you haven't worked in industry for 20 years, or you haven't been growing the plant for 50 years. Maybe you have, I don't know, you've got a good climate down there. But these are important perspectives. We need all the voices at the table. Cary, I don't know, do you have anything to add from your perspective? I want to share the opportunity with you, since you've obviously worked with industry stakeholders together, but through the ASTM process versus maybe being on your own.
Well, I think that standardization itself is a beautiful thing, and in an industry like cannabis, I think is imperative. Without standardization, it's the wild, wild west. And I think it's a different dynamic in Canada, right? It's just a different dynamic because of the legalization aspects of cannabis in Canada. They've got their own, the Canadian cannabis issues. And in the United States, it's when we have multiple states with somewhat different rules, and it's legal here and it's not legal here, there's room for lots of black market activity that creates product that people die from. And I think I'm glad to hear that there are regulators on this program and listening to us, because I think we really need to continue to push and get as many regulators involved in our standardization work, and get their input to take back and hopefully influence regulations that make sense, that do bring safety down to the consumer, and that are economically viable for what could be a very lucrative industry if run properly, and good for humanity, I think, as well. But that things are really challenging in the United States, right? Because of everything I just said. I mean, I live in Louisiana, and if I get caught with a bag of weed, I get executed by the side of the road by very enthusiastic redneck sheriffs. But that's cool. I mean, they do keep crime down low up here in Chalmette. But by the same token, there's a CBD store across the street, and I can go and I can buy Delta 9, Delta 10 buds infused with THC, just like I was in Chicago or Michigan or Colorado. The only difference is that is a synthetic infusion, or it's a synthesized isomer of THC with no control, no regulation or anything. And we know that to synthesize or to change the chemistry of cannabis normally involves some pretty nasty solvents, like stuff that you want to make sure you remove, but there's no assays, there's no residual solvent checks or anything. And I've had friends that have literally had to go to the hospital after buying some of that product and imbibing it. That's where we really, really need to focus our efforts in getting the regulators on the same page and getting our federal government to pull its head out of its whatever. I'm sorry, I was just being creative in my vernacular. We need some standardization in the legal application across this country, so that we can have have one thing that we're dealing with that is united across the United States, and get rid of all this potential black market harm thing going because of what I'm going to say is the Farm Bill, which is a great thing, but it's not understood, and it's certainly taken advantage of at many levels. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, Cary, you kind of brought me to two things I want to follow on with that. And I'm going to go in order. I wrote it down so I don't forget. But the illicit market versus the legal marketplace. And I think there's arguments. I know me talking with a lot of folks in Canada where estimates are 50 to 75% of the marketplace, of when people can purchase cannabis is not from the regulated market. And so if I'm a business owner, or even if let alone regulator, that's your competition. right? These folks don't have to adhere to any minimum standards, even set up by Health Canada, and consumers are buying that. So there's a major, optics issue there in terms of credibility and trust that because of, some of the issues we've had, and you see that firsthand in Louisiana. So I think, where I want to go with that is, how do standards solve that issue? And maybe it's a matter of, I like to say when I did a webinar recently, call a scientist, right? Cary, I just heard you talk about, synthetics and isomers and, the different solvents or reagents. Those are important details that perhaps should they be hashed out in ASTM as a solution through a standard, or should that just be, should the regulators or Congress say, is Congress qualified to address this? So I guess let me rephrase my question, right? We could ask Congress or state legislators to address this issue, but it's really complex, right? And the science and issues involving it with all the different isomers, is that really something suited, or is that a perfect example of where folks can come to the table, use the ASTM process to create a standard to provide protections?
Well, I think every standard that provides protections adds value. And every person that dies from getting their fingers into stuff they shouldn't have that might have been regulated creates a blemish on that potential legalization event. And really, it's almost a damage control thing at this point. We can't standardize legalization, but we can employ standards and really push them to at least maybe save some lives, which would be a good thing. For my personal experience would say that would be a good thing. And, those are the kind of things we can start with. But if we have the regulators sitting with us at those tables and hearing those discussions, I think that brings more power to them coming back to their environments. And by the way, I heard this, and I don't know how regulation, everything's become so political. I don't know if it's a big gameplay or a chessboard or what. It just seems like practical science ought to tell the tale. And that's what we can do best. Provide that and hope that that's embraced. Short of that, we're not going to standardize legalization. Although it would be nice to write a standard for our government, say this is the ASTM test the specification for establishing legalization of cannabis. Who knows? Maybe that's something we should try and see what happens.
Well, it's possible. Ralph, go ahead. You probably get some perspectives on this.
Yeah, I was going to add to what Cary said. All of this is very good in the sense that, we can't write a standard for legalization, of course. However, the better and the stronger our standards are, the easier it is for regulators to start incorporating these standards and to help them to make them be more assured or reassured that they're allowing safer products out on the market. Because one of the big things with the black market, of course, and we see this in Canada and elsewhere, not just with the world of cannabis, but in other areas, is it affect one bad product. Like in Canada, we had some issues where in the same place where they were selling illegally selling cannabis, in the same garage, they were manufacturing opioids. And so the opioid dust goes on the cannabis, and then the people on the street who buy it from them die from opioid overdose. It's not the cannabis, but yet it's the cannabis industry that gets hit with this. So that's why it's critical to have everybody there and discussing these things to make sure that we can at least make things as safe as possible. You can't eliminate the black market. That's where the government does play a role, in the sense that if it is legalized, then they have to come down hard on those who are from the black market. So that, because they did some studies and some surveys in Canada with Statistics Canada did that. And they showed that other than, the college students, etc., most people are not willing to jeopardize their career and their reputation by having a criminal record for buying something which is illegal. So they were willing to spend an extra buck to get the legal stuff. However, if the government starts saying, okay, well, we're going to start charging you $5 more, well, then obviously the temptation is going to be there to go to the black market. But we found in Canada, when we deal with analyzing in our labs, analyzing confiscated products, that the stuff that's available on the street is very high in pesticides, extremely high. People don't know what it's being cut with. It's still the issue. So it's safer for everybody to be able to buy it from a legal facility.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph, for that. So I've got a few questions coming up here. We've got about 15 minutes left. So if you haven't asked a question that you want, please throw it in there. I don't know if we'll have a good answer to this, but I gave it a good look, and they reference UL, and UL, for folks that aren't aware, right, Underwriters Laboratories. And they reference, would a UL certification be best to obtain with an electric herbalizer, or would a different private certification body be more advisable? And they reference UL 499. Now, I'm personally not familiar with UL 499. I did quickly Google it, and the one answer I kind of want to prep with is, thinking about fit for purpose, right? And our standards fit for purpose. And I think the example we could look at is in the cannabis industry with product testing. And we can test for pesticides in all sorts of different matrices. This was my background with soil samples, right? Water samples, but getting it in the cannabis plant or a gummy bear or a chocolate is completely different. And so if you apply that as is a method or a standard fit for purpose, and perhaps UL 499 is the best we have, but perhaps there's nuances there that it's not 100% in terms of some of the considerations of a device like a vaporizer that you inhale. Ralph, do you have any? I see you came off mute. Kind of share your perspectives.
Sure. So UL4, I don't know UL 499 specifically, but for whomever is asking that question, in Canada, UL is the driver behind something called International Working Agreements with 37 through ISO, and they are looking at putting some of these standards into something which would apply to the cannabis industry, but they're still waiting for ISO to approve the technical committee, and that report's been out for over a year and a half. So ISO is a very slow process in my view, but they're, of course, UL has sometimes come to ASTM to help develop some of these standards as well. So, but yeah, if there's a standard there that helps, of course, it's looking at which is available for if that's good for extractors or whichever it is, then absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ralph. I think the only thing I want to add to that is looking to standards that can fit these boxes in the absence of any other guidance is the best thing as anybody can do. You don't have to wait for the perfect solution, but to even say, hey, this standard exists and how can I meet the spirit of it, whether it's UL 499 or look at the Code of Federal Regulations. A lot of folks that, Cary, you mentioned earlier, 21 CFR 111 or 117 for good manufacturing practices. There's the World Health Organization. Use those that are vetted and applied in major commodity marketplaces to protect consumers, and find the weaknesses, and you can drive improvement by developing them as cannabis specific standards when needed through the ASTM process, or partner with other organizations. I think that's really key. So I just want to really emphasize and applaud anybody that is looking at standards as, can I use that for my product or my device in the absence of something more valuable? So that's one other question I want to address too, and I think this ties in well, is about ASTM's view on newish industries. So cannabis is obviously a great poster child for newish industries. I know that they were going to have a committee on tiny homes, but now they're having a subcommittee on tiny homes. That it's new industries that come to ASTM that will add to the 147 or 48 number. So when there's a limited number of regulators to participate in the process, given that, say, not all states, countries, or jurisdictions are quote on board yet, how does ASTM kind of view that? Ralph, I think you're probably the best person to address that from your lens. Would you give us some insight?
Well, sure. There's always actually elements of the regulators are available in one way or another. If it's something that's being sold, so you'll have the consumer side of things, whichever department would be in the States or in Canada and around the world. So there's always a way of being part of that committee. For example, at ASTM, there's a consumer products committee. So it could be going through there. So there's always a way of finding government agencies or to participate. And that's where, again, ASTM has people based in Washington, actually, and they can help recruit some of those regulators to come to the table and be part of it. So there's always a way. And again, you look at cannabis as an example. ASTM, went through the board, and to the board's credit, they were willing to take the risk that something like this was useful and could be done, and we could get government people at the table to get the balanced committees, and it's happened. So it's there, and even if it's newish, it can happen. There's a lot of newish ones, whether it was 3D printing, advanced manufacturing, all of these things, exoskeletons. You can look at a whole list of things that are at ASTM. They were new when they started. Not all of them were well established in another. Sometimes they get established in another subcommittee. You mentioned, for example, tiny homes. So tiny homes could be in a committee, and then eventually, once they become stronger, they can go out and branch out on their own.
Yeah, I think that's, again, goes back to the beauty of the process, and there's many ways to participate and engage and protect consumers, whether it's developing a single standard, pushing for a new subcommittee, participating in an existing subcommittee, which is of course part of a larger committee, or finding the need to support the formation of a new committee for an emerging marketplace that truly has no home and needs it to ensure credibility and safety. It's an amazingly powerful tool to be able to do that. We're getting close to closing, so I want to share wrap up and share a few things before we go to final thoughts from both of yourselves, Ralph and Cary. I really appreciate all of this. I think it's been really engaging. I also want to recognize, this has been an ASTM heavy conversation, as I mentioned earlier. There's many other standards bodies, which, we talked about. And as you mentioned, Ralph, they're all unique, right? Like ASTM provides literally a bottom-up process where Cary Black can show up and say, I have an idea about a need for a standard. And as long as it fits in within that broad scope of the committee, there's essentially nothing stopping Cary as an individual or consumer, user, or industry, or even if you were to be a regulator, and to put that forward. And that's what's unique about ASTM and lends to its broad scope. At the same time, there are other organizations, and I want to highlight two that I know are active in the ASTM cannabis process, right? AOAC International, another organization that's been around for over a century. That has developed, lots of test methods in the food industry. Folks are very familiar with them. That's their sweet spot, right? Different process. Same with US Pharmacopoeia. US Pharmacopoeia, they're over 200 years old now, right? They have over 40 countries that rely on their monographs default for protecting the quality of medicines. And I'm very grateful that we've had an amazing relationship with US Pharmacopoeia. There's webinars and joint workshops we've done with them. That's the zone of expertise that comes back to, it's not just ASTM, it's not just ISO, USP or AC. We need all of us at the table. We need all the regulators, we need all of industry, until we're truly all at the table working together within our processes. We're not leveraging the opportunities that we have to really solve some of the perplexing problems while we wait for federal legalization to happen. There's a lot of work we can and should be doing now to make it easier when federal legalization does happen eventually. I'm sure, Ralph, you maybe wish that ASTM and there were folks looking for it before Canada legalized in 2018, but I think you guys have done a pretty darn good job, and it's been great to have yourself and Health Canada among others at the table there. But come join. We need everybody at the table, right? And again, thank you to the other organizations that exist. So with my soapbox wrapping up here, we've got about 5 minutes. Cary, I'm going to go to you first, and then I'm going to let the mic drop fall with Ralph at the end to close us out. So Cary, you're doing a workshop in October, so a little bit more than just standards. I'm assuming this is your final thought, but if there's something else you want to share, please do. But please talk about the October workshop on contaminants and what folks should know about with regards to that workshop in October.
No, I'd be happy to. Final thought, appreciate you inviting Ralph and I to come in and chat. It's been quite enjoyable. And I encourage any regulators that are listening, and everyone else for that matter, come sit at a table with us and let's start talking about stuff. And I strongly encourage that. October 10th to the 12th, Rob, Thomas, and myself are co-chairing a global symposium on contaminants, basically in cannabis. And it'll be 3 days. The first days will focus on elemental impurities, the second on pesticides, and the third on microbials. And this will have a series of talks of people doing the latest and greatest research, the most recent data, really trying to assess where we are and with suggestions of where we need to go, perhaps even to help the regulatory process and what do we need to be testing for in that. I had the honor of having Ralph is providing a keynote address at the beginning. We also have Dr. Rob O'Brien from Canada, who's an incredible researcher in analytical techniques revolving around cannabis. It's an important topic, and we certainly encourage everyone to come play with us. It'll be fun. Anyway, I don't want to take Ralph's time away from himself. Thank you all.
No.
Appreciate you.
Thank you, Cary. And yeah, Rob O'Brien, a good friend as well that I consider a friend. He was on a previous webinar, 2 months ago now, here at When Things Go Wrong. So, what is it, 2 days or 3 days? I think 3-day symposium.
October 10th through October 12th, 3 days.
Perfect. And the link is there. Registration's not open yet, but bookmark that and know that there will be emails coming out when registration opens up to register. I believe it'll be free and an amazing educational opportunity. So thank you, Cary, for the, yep. Next week, registration opens up. Stay tuned.
Yes.
Ralph, take us home, sir. What's your final thoughts and what do you want to get across to the audience today if we didn't already?
Sure. So thank you, David, for putting this together. I think it's great. The more we get to help people understand what standards are all about, how it's done, the more we can get them to participate. I know for many people, they may think standards are cut and dry and it's boring and stuff like that. But honestly, come to the table, you'll see how much we value your opinions and your views. Even if we disagree with them, you have a chance to convince us, and that's the way we do it. If you're at the table, you get to influence the standard, you get to make things better for everybody, not just for your company or your organization, but for the entire stakeholders and industries. So that's a fantastic way of doing it. You mentioned USP, of course, as you know, but not anybody else knows. USP is part of the process at ASTM with us. They sit on and we discuss things regularly to make sure. The key is all of these bodies are out there. There's so much work to do in cannabis. There's no need to compete. It's picking up different niches and going ahead and focusing on those. And I think that's why most of us are working. And the more people who are at the table, some of us are members of at ASTM, we're members of USP, we're members at AOAC and vice versa. And to make sure that we get to right standards. And again, it's all aspects, whether it's users, government regulators, or industry, or government lab people. We need all the views to know that what's being produced makes sense, and that you'll be happy at the end with what's available. And then if you're, as a regulator, if you're there, it'll be easier for you to want to incorporate that standard in your regulations. So with that, honestly, come to the table. If you're not there, you're missing out. And we look forward to seeing you.
Well said, Ralph. Well, look, thank you to all the attendees that showed up and stayed through. Ralph and Cary, thank you as always. I continue to learn from you guys every time we get to spend time together, whether it's on a webinar or at a meeting in person. So again, thank you so much for your time. We covered a lot. I could talk about standards for forever. So if there's questions you didn't get answered, or you want to know more about how to get involved, shoot me an email, and look forward for follow-ups from us. And stay tuned for next month's episode, where we're going to continue an international theme, because we live in the US, at least me personally. Ralph, you're north of us, but we have to think about and leverage what's going on globally. So I'm looking forward to bringing some great global perspectives next month. So with that, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, everybody, and look forward to talking with you all soon. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.